All right, we still have some people piling in, but I think we're going to go ahead and get started. We actually just ran this webinar in Europe and in Asia earlier today, and we ran a little bit over, so I want to make sure that we have enough time to get through all the content and to answer everyone's questions. So with that, we're going to start today's webinar introducing Jasper Reports IO, a new breed of reporting and data visualization engine. This is an extremely exciting webinar for us at TIBCO and Jaspersoft. This is a brand new product we're going to be talking about today, and so hopefully you are equally as excited. And as the subtitle, I guess, indicates, reporting and data visualization in a world of cloud, microservices, and DevOps, this new engine that we're going to be introducing to you is really well suited for these sorts of environments. And it's really unique in that way. And we're going to explore that, as you'll see, from a slide standpoint and talk about the what and why of Jasper Reports IO, and then you're going to see a large portion of today's webinar is actually going to be a live demo of this new service that we're introducing. So with that, let's go ahead and move forward and introduce you to who you're going to be hearing from today. So currently speaking is Shane Switterick, myself, product marketing manager at TIBCO, and I'm dedicated to the Jaspersoft group. I'm based in our San Francisco office, and we have some awesome guests that are joining us today. Jan Schiffman is the VP of Engineering at TIBCO, working on the Jaspersoft product group and the TIBCO Data Science product group. He's based in the same office as me, actually, in San Francisco. And we're also extremely fortunate to have Theodore Danchu on board. Theodore is actually one of the co-founders of Jaspersoft and the chief architect, the chief developer, the guy who built Jasper Reports Library, if you're familiar with that product. And he's also the chief architect behind Jasper Reports IO. So there's no one better to kind of introduce us to this new product than Theodore and Jan. And with that, let's go ahead and take a quick look at the agenda. We're going to go through a couple of polling questions, and then we're going to get right into the content. So the agenda is going to look a little bit like this. We want to talk a little bit about why Jasper Reports IO before we introduce you to what it is. And so Jan's going to talk a little bit about some trends in the embedded BI space and also some trends in software development and how those trends are intersecting. And that's going to lead to the introduction of Jasper Reports IO. We'll tell you what it is. Theodore is going to take you through the live demo portion and show you a lot of great resources and materials to help you get started along the way. And then finally, we're going to end with, there's actually going to be, as you'll see, several iterations of Jasper Reports IO. So we'll introduce you to what's available today, what you can try out and where you can try it out, and then show you what's coming next with some of the later releases of Jasper Reports IO. And finally, one thing I failed to mention on the last slide, two things. This webinar is being recorded. This is a question we always get, and it will be sent out within a day or two of the webinar's completion. So if that's a question or concern you had in mind, you'll get both the webinar recording as well as the slides. And also, if you have any questions throughout the course of today's webinar, we've had a lot in some of the previous sessions, please plug those into the Q&A box within the Zoom portal, and not the chat box. The Q&A box is just more visible for us. And then more importantly, if we aren't able to get your question, we get a record of all the Q&A questions automatically sent to us afterwards. So that will allow us to follow up with you. All right, so let's move on and go through two quick polling questions. And the Opportunity Edition, you're using both the library and server, Commercial Edition, excuse me, and you're using server, or you're not using Jaspersoft. So I see a number of people are already inputting responses. We'll give everyone another 20 or 30 seconds, and then we'll take a look at the results. All right, I think we have wow, very high participation rate. I'm very, very pleased about that. So we've got the Commercial Edition server taking the win with 44%. The Community Edition, both library and server, is making up for 24%. And we have 20% that are actually not using Jaspersoft, which is actually great. And we're going to be talking about Jaspersoft in a way that's going to be in the layman and familiar if you're not familiar with Jaspersoft. So don't think that we're going to be alienating you with all Jaspersoft specific terms today. And the community edition came out with 11%. So we got a great distribution, but it looks like the majority of users are using one of the commercial editions of Jaspersoft. Great, so I've got one more question for you. We'll move on to the next slide.
Is that your next slide, Shane?
One more slide, if you don't mind, Jan.
Sorry about that. We have some people are having a conversation in the chat, and I just wanted to point out to all the participants that you should be auto-muted. So you shouldn't be concerned if you're not seeing the mute indicator or icon available. As this is a webinar, by default, all participants except the panelists are muted. Sorry, Shane.
No, that's perfect. All confidential conversations you're having on your own line, we cannot hear. So have those with that peace in mind. All right, so one last question, then we're going to get to today's content. So the second question, I'm launching this poll now, is are you currently leveraging container technology? And as you might have guessed based on the intro, this is something we're going to be covering today. So your 4 options here are, yes, we run containers in our production deployments. B, yes, but you're really just using it for testing or non-deployment environments. No, but you are looking to start leveraging soon. Or you have no plans. So again, I'll give everyone another 20 or 30 seconds. We'll look at the results and then we will continue. All right, we've got about 70% of people having voted. So let's start taking a look at the results. And currently it looks like the #1 response is no, but you're looking to start leveraging soon, which is great. That came in at 43%. 27% have no plans. 23% are actually, or 24% are running in production deployments, which is great. And then 7 are testing it, but they're not currently running it in any production environments. So appreciate everyone for your responses on both of those answers. That's going to really help Jan and Theodore as we're moving through today's content to make sure that it's tailored and relevant and at the level that you are with all of these technologies. So with that, I'm actually going to hand things over to Jan Schiffman, who's going to be taking you through some of the market trends that I mentioned and then introduce you to Jasper Reports.io. So over to you, Jan.
Thanks so much, Shane. Okay, well, it sounds like we have a good cross-section of people who have used the product and are using some of the technologies we're going to be talking about today, including containerization. So this is great. Hopefully, no one will be bored and probably no one should be lost. So first, let's talk a little bit about something that's a bit higher level before we get into the technology itself. And let's talk about the shift to embedded BI and what we mean by that and why it's significant and how that factors into JRIO and why we built it. So what is embedded BI? Right. So traditionally, certainly traditionally for me, BI was something that lived apart from the application in which you actually took action, in which you actually made your decision. It was more of a decision support kind of technology. And the problem with that was you'd be switching context. So perhaps you'd be looking at a bar chart or a graph or a spreadsheet. And then you'd switch back to your operational application, and then you take some action based on that. But you had to discern what was the right information from that visualization or from that report that I saw, and how does it apply to the decision I'm about to make? So technologies have evolved, and sort of processes and expectations, and just application design has evolved to the point now where we embed this BI, these visualizations, these reports, this information directly within the application in which you take action. So now they're within the same context, and it's fully integrated into the user experience. So we say that insights delivered in the context of the application, that being the right place, and is presented to the user at the time of action, that's the right time. And it integrates seamlessly into the user experience. Now, there's been this shift towards what we call consumerization for applications, including enterprise applications, really driven by this focus over the past 10 years on user experience. A lot of that was driven by mobile apps and was driven by the capabilities of browsers. They became more sophisticated, were able to create better interactions, better designed experiences within the browser as HTML and JavaScript have evolved. And now that's a critical part of every application, including enterprise applications. So embedded BI is a key component of that. So how do we embed it in applications? Well, not surprisingly, for modern web-based applications, it's using HTML and JavaScript. Right? These are the technologies we use to build our front-end experiences within the browser, and not only in the browser. Of course, there are HTML and JavaScript technologies that you can use to build your mobile app. For example, React Native. Electron allows you to use HTML and JavaScript to build applications for your desktop. An example of that being Slack or Atom. JavaScript and web service APIs also allow for the seamless integration between the BI service and the application. So your front end can be talking to a bunch of web service APIs. They can cause actions to be taken on the back end processes wherever they may be. And JavaScript then can take data and results and responses from those services and integrate them right into the user experience together, right in the application. For Jaspersoft, our technologies like Visualize.js, they promote shorter time to market. So your app developers focus on the application, not on the mechanics of where am I getting my visualization, how am I going to make it fit in? And information workers really focus more on the embedded information. What kind of data am I accessing? Do I need to transform it? What do I need to do to that data so it's no longer data but real information that I can embed in an application for a user to interact with? So let's take a look at an example of a real customer of ours who has actually demonstrated a lot of the principles I've just mentioned in their application, which is a learning management application. This application allows students to interact with this learning portal. There's an element of gamification. You can see that the UX was designed first, and it's a very high quality UX. They use a lot of very good design principles. And so the challenge was, how do we integrate BI into this application in a way that's seamless? Well, this is an example of a Jasper report. This is one of the ways we did it. Now, of course, these users use Jaspersoft Studio, which is a very sophisticated tool, really capable of creating any kind of data-driven visualization. And this is how they did it. So this is effectively, it just is a report document. It's made up of icons. It's made up of just some textual information, but it's been formatted and designed such a way that it integrates seamlessly into the application. This, of course, is also Jaspersoft visualization. This is a custom one that was created using Jaspersoft Studio as well. And this is a little more traditional in that you can tell that this is a chart of one kind. It's a circular knob chart, but it's a little more obvious than perhaps that list I was just showing you. Here's just another example of a report that actually allows action to be taken. So if we consider that a report, at the end of the day, really is just text, numbers, really just a lot of string data. These find content buttons are JavaScript buttons, but to the report, they're just some character output. When it's interpreted by the browser, well, now they become buttons that actually have actions attached to them and can allow the user to actually take an action within the application. So again, when we talk about embedded BI and seamless embedding into an existing user experience, this is what we mean. That's not always obvious. So thank you for bearing with me during that explanation. So let's talk about a few trends in software development. Let's first talk about cloud platforms, then containerization, DevOps, microservices, and orchestration, and how these things fit together and how they all, when brought together, can create a modern cloud-native application architecture. Sorry, need a little more coffee there. All right, so I think everyone is probably familiar with cloud platforms. Cloud platforms although new to many of us, are not really new in a technical sense. The first cloud platforms were not surprisingly the result of a DARPA project in the US in the 1960s. The idea was, could you have network computing at scale? This evolved over time. And again, in the 80s and 90s, you had pioneers like Sun, and I believe their motto was, the network is the system, or the network is the computer. So, I mean, there were these ideas that one day we would have these abstracted, distributed computing environments on a network. We now refer to it as a cloud. But this was not something that just arose in the past few years. Now, it wasn't really until the probably mid-2000s that you had some organizations like Salesforce using it to create their CRM cloud, Google using it to actually scale out their own search engine so they could deploy their PageRank algorithm at scale. And then, of course, in 2006, you had Amazon releasing AWS, and that was really bringing infrastructure as a service to the masses, to app builders everywhere. Let's talk about containerization, because this is a key enabling technology for modern cloud native architectures. So again, containers themselves, although new to most of us, not a completely new technology. There were some capabilities built into Unix and Linux. They're called share root jails, and really what they allowed was individual users to have their own application space. So you could create these virtual user spaces, as they were called, that were isolated from one another, so that if I was running applications within mine, someone else's wouldn't be aware of the processes that I owned. But we all shared the same underlying kernel. It was a very, very efficient way to use limited resources. We all had the same base runtime, but yet we could have these different environments running on top of it, all separate from one another. Very different from a VM, in which you have virtual machine hypervisor, you have the operating system, and every VM has to have its own instance of the operating system as well. So there's a lot of resources used just for that baseline, just to have the environment in which your app can run. These containers, all sharing this same common low-level runtime, use resources much more efficiency. So what are some properties that make them so useful? So isolation, the ability to run multiple containers on the same VM. And as I was saying, we should interchange VM and server freely. We just call it a VM because no one really runs these things on bare metal servers anymore. People run a VM, and then on top of that, you would run multiple containers. This isolation means that one container running one application is isolated from another. So if that container should fail and disappear for any reason, none of the other containers on that virtual machine are affected in any way. Portability. When you have an application running in a container, you can take what's called an image of that container, and it becomes portable so that you can actually deploy that onto any system running, in our case, the Docker runtime, regardless of the operating system. And scalability. There is a complementary technology called orchestration and scheduling that allows you to manage your containers and allows you to manage their life cycle, meaning this management layer can create new containers and can destroy them. And there are reasons that you would want to do that dynamically. For instance, scaling with a change in load in your application. But we'll see in a minute why this is so important. Shane, is that okay? Is that clearer?
Yeah, you sound great.
Okay, good. All right, let's talk for a moment about DevOps, right? Probably many of us are familiar with DevOps. I bet there are lots of us that actually practice DevOps. So DevOps obviously is an amalgam of development and operations, and it's as much a philosophy as it really is a set of defined processes and technologies. But DevOps brings the operational and deployment side of building software and deploying applications to the actual developers and the coding side of it. So as you can see here, the flow typically is build code or create code, build it, test it, deploy it. Right? And this becomes a very agile process. So when changes are made, let's look at sort of a typical DevOps pipeline. Changes are made to a source code repository. It automatically kicks off a build process. Once the artifact is built, it's then put into an environment where it can be tested through automation. If it passes, it can then be optionally deployed out to a production environment. Now, that's really in the case of a SaaS application, and this is sort of a standard way of actually coding, building, testing, and deploying to a SaaS application. And there are lots of SaaS platforms out there, some of the ones I mentioned previously, that actually update every day, and they use this very process. Now, when you introduce something like microservice technology into this picture, you'll see why this really becomes a critical component of modern cloud-native architectures, and this ability to very quickly build, test, and then deploy to production. So let's talk for a minute about microservices. So really, what are microservices, and how do they build on the technologies that we've just been talking about? Well, they're independently implemented and deployed and scaled. They typically are run inside containers. So if you can imagine this very lightweight container, again, somewhat analogous to a virtual machine, but much lighter weight and much more efficient. These microservices are designed to fit within these containers. They communicate with one another in the outside world via APIs. You can write a microservice in any language you want. Now, I didn't list every language here, but Node.js, Python, Ruby, Java are popular, but equally popular is the language Go and C as well. So you'll find an entire range of languages being used to actually implement these microservices. And they integrate into CI and CD processes and pipelines. That's continuous integration, continuous deployment. And that's that build, test, deploy part of the DevOps pipeline I mentioned before. See someone's up here in the chat windows, want to make sure. Okay, make sure someone wasn't complaining that I was cutting out again. And microservices, I think it's important here to mention that the concept of an individual service, of a code base that performs one service, is not entirely new. Some of you may remember, and I certainly do. There was a time when the market was focused on something called service-oriented architecture, SOA. And in some ways, it isn't that different. Now, SOA wasn't designed on the concept of microservices. These are larger services, but they perform one set of functions. Microservices sort of take this idea to an extreme. A microservice is supposed to perform one small specific task. And we'll look at an example here in just a moment where it makes this a bit clearer. But if you can imagine your application is made up of something that clears credit card transactions, something that gives a list of available products to a consumer, and another one that schedules delivery. Each of these would be separate microservices. They would be coded separately, they would be running independently in containers, and would be talking to one another across the network using APIs, typically web service APIs, but they don't have to be. So it takes this idea of separating all the services that make up your application sort of to an extreme. So you can code them separately. You can scale them separately within your environment, and we'll see in a second why that's so important. Now, on top of microservices, we have this concept of orchestration. So you have all of these microservices. So let's say now, instead of having my old monolithic application, I now have a nice, shiny, new, cloud-native, modern microservice architecture. Well, now I've got tons of little services. Now, that can be very difficult to control them. And that's why we often use the metaphor of referring to VMs and monolithic servers as pets versus microservices and containers, which we refer to as cattle. So when you have a pet, you can give all your attention to it. You want to make sure it's well taken care of. It's fed. You want to keep it happy because you do not want it to go down. It's critical that it stays up. Whereas a microservice running in the container, we call them cattle because they can be ephemeral. They're all commodity. Containers with running a microservice typically are just one of many. So if one should go down, another one will come to replace it immediately. And what takes care of that? What takes care of all this management and scheduling across all of these microservices to make sure that they're all operating, they're all talking to one another? It's a lot to take care of. So we have this orchestration layer. In this case, the icon used is the captain's wheel. This is Kubernetes. Kubernetes has become a dominant orchestration layer, originally from Google. When Docker first came out, which is the predominant containerization technology now, they had their own version of orchestration. It was called Swarm, but the standard now really is Google's Kubernetes, and it does a lot of things. I won't get into the details because it can get very technical, and that would be great for perhaps a separate conversation or presentation. But just know that these orchestration layers are capable of managing the life cycle. They're managing the exposition of services, meaning exposing the services from each of these microservices, scaling and durability, meaning they can make sure that each service is always available. If a number of the containers in which that service is running go down, it creates new ones immediately, so you don't lose that part of the service. And it allows you to remotely manage what's going on through this one interface that's provided by this orchestration layer. So let's for a moment take a look at the monolithic architecture I was referring to. And I'm sure that this diagram is pretty familiar to many of you. Your traditional monolithic web application typically is made up of a set of services. The services interact with one another. Each of the services has its own dedicated business logic. Below that, the business logic will speak through a data abstraction layer, perhaps an ORM like Hibernate, and ultimately there's a database behind it where all the data is persisted. On the front end, many cases you have UI components that render the UI where the user will interact with the application, and a web service API where you'll perhaps integrate with other systems, other servers within your environment. And this has been a very stable, very traditional architecture for the monolithic web deployed application for years, right? Going back to the 90s. So let's take a look at some of the advantages and disadvantages of this. We're going to focus more on the disadvantages. Traditional BI platforms, and say and vendors in general, don't integrate well into modern cloud architectures. And why not? Well, they're typically built for end users and integrators, right? They are not designed for deployment in sophisticated, very, very agile, complex, composed application environments. They're generally cloud compatible, meaning that if it's a web deployed application, whether it's Tomcat or WebSphere or Glassfish or whatever have you, they are Java-based application servers. Yes, you can do what we call lifting and shifting them into the cloud, but what does that really get you? You simply moved it from your server to someone else's server. You don't have to worry about the hardware, but you haven't really gained any of the advantages of truly being native on the cloud. They have high resource requirements. So if your monolithic application, if that server is sitting idle, you're using a lot of resources just because it's up and running. Not that they're providing you with any business benefits. It's just because the way the application is designed, it needs a certain amount of memory. It's going to need just a certain amount of regular compute. And that's very inefficient. And they don't scale with demand well. Now, yes, there are clustering technologies and even some more specific ones like Elastic Beanstalk in AWS, but they're not fast at scaling with demand. And again, you don't have fine-grained control over it. If you have 1,000 users on a server and suddenly another 100 users hit your site and you need to scale up to another server to handle those extra 100, well, now you're only utilizing 10% of that new server you had to spin up because your aggregate is 1,100. So again, you're lacking that kind of efficiency. And you can do a lot better by using a more modern architecture. So let's take a look at a modern cloud architecture. Now, in some ways, there are many components here that we just saw on the previous slide, but they're in a different context and they're being used slightly differently. So let's start at a different point. Let's start all the way over to the left side of this slide and take a look at the user experience. Now, again, the user experience is something that you can have your user experience team focus on completely independent of the back end, right? This user experience, whether it's on a mobile device or it's in the browser or in a desktop application, is going to speak to an API that's defined by the API gateway. And this API gateway sits between your services, which make up your application, and the actual front-end app, or that's what we're referring to as the user experience, where the user actually interacts with the app. Now, what does the API gateway do? Well, microservices render APIs. Some of those APIs are really suited to talking to other microservices and those kind of more complicated interactions. Other APIs are designed to send data right back to the user and to receive requests from the user. So the API gateway will decide how to route these requests. The API gateway can also take care of things like ensuring we don't have too many users trying to hit the gateway or one service all at once. Or if we have too many requests coming in, the orchestration layer could say, hey, we need more of this individual service. And we'll talk about that kind of scaling aspect in a second. The API gateway can also make sure that users making requests have the appropriate access control rights to actually access that service. So this is a very, very important part of this application, this gateway, to bring the services rendered by these microservices all together in a meaningful way. So moving over to the right, let's take a look at some of these microservices.
Let's suppose this is a travel reservation application. So I, the user, interacting with the front end, with the user experience, I want to book 3 days at a hotel in New York after New Year's. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to send my location and the dates I want to book a room for. I'm going to send that request through an API provided by the API gateway. The API gateway is going to route that to one of these services. Let's say it's the one in the upper left here, right by the word microservices. That one's going to receive a location, it's going to receive some dates. It is then going to make a call, let's say, to the microservice directly to the right of it. And it's going to make a request to that microservice saying, hey, give me a list of all the hotels in New York. And then it's going to send that back. It's going to send that back to the user. The user's then going to pick a hotel and then going to, again, send the dates. That's going to go to yet another microservice. That microservice is then going to send off that request to the reservation system for the specific hotel. So you're getting the idea that each one of these microservices, they actually are focused on one specific task. Let's say at the end of this whole experience, the user decides, okay, you know what? I picked my hotel, I picked my dates, I have a room rate, I want to actually book the rooms. Yet another one of these services will be the one to actually clear the credit card transaction. So what I've done is I've taken my application that used to be one monolith, that used to work, everything you had to work together at one time. Changing one part could disrupt things that are happening in another. If I wanted to make a change to one service, I had to rebuild the entire application. Now I have an architecture that allows me to make changes to individual pieces of my app without disrupting the others. I can actually redesign my credit card clearing interface microservice, or the one that returns the list of hotels, or the one that actually will receive the location and the dates. What you can also do under this orchestration layer is you can dynamically scale up or down each of these individual services. If suddenly you have a whole bunch of transactions waiting to clear, you can take the microservice that actually handles credit card transaction clearing and massively scale that up to handle that volume so that the user experience stays consistent. The user doesn't end up waiting just because the system has a lot of transactions going through it. That component, that service, gets scaled up to handle that volume, and when the volume subsides, it's scaled back down. The other thing I wanted to point out here, and I'll be quick about it, is if you look all the way over to the right, you'll see cloud platform services. This is also important because as you're building these on a modern cloud platform, if you're using one open to the public like AWS, they provide a lot of services that you can take advantage of just because you're on the platform. So if you look at the first icon, that one looks somewhat like a brain. I think what we're implying there is perhaps you could use something like Google's TensorFlow to have a machine learning model that perhaps would automatically calculate a discount for this user and say, hey, you know, a good discount for this user and one that's cost effective for us would be offer them a 4th night at half price. So you can have a sophisticated model and integrate it right into your application. Below that, cloud storage. It's going to be a lot more effective to have robust, redundant, high availability cloud storage than perhaps managing your own databases. And below that, we have the gear at the cloud in it, which really indicates miscellaneous cloud-based services. It can be anything from alerting to messaging to cloud server monitoring or process monitoring, and all of the things that all of these platforms continually add as services that you can take advantage of. So now we have an application that's more flexible, that has better performance, that is easier to modify because we can redevelop individual components without interrupting the others and leverage all of the capabilities that are being added to modern cloud platforms all the time. Okay, so let's take a look now at some trends on a collision path. We talked about BI being increasingly embedded in applications. And again, here's the familiar illustration from our customer from the first couple of slides. We have app architecture, which is moving to decoupled lightweight services, as we just saw within the cloud native environment. So what if we took the two and combined them together? We had the ability to embed directly into modern web-based, web-deployed applications, and at the same time took advantage of this new component decoupled lightweight service cloud-native architecture. We would have Jasper Reports IO. Jasper Reports IO, that's what we're talking about today. It's designed for the cloud. It allows you to embed reports and visualizations via web service and JavaScript APIs. It's very, very lightweight. It's designed for container usage and cloud architectures, and it integrates into DevOps processes and pipelines, as we discussed earlier. So what are some of its basic capabilities? Production reporting, right? Scheduled document production in all the output forms and formats that we typically provide with JR Library. Interactive reports, which are either page-based reports, tabular reports, or interactive visualizations, and report bursting. So you can also have a burst of reports that go out, perhaps a month-end reconciliation, you need to send out financial statements or what have you. Embedded reports and visualizations using Visualize.js that I think many of you are familiar with. Again, we provide a subset of this, really focused on just the capabilities of JRIO to easily add visualizations to any web application without using an iframe, embedding directly into an element on the page, interacting with the app around it, and it integrates seamlessly into your existing user experience, again, as we saw in the example from the learning management system from Waggle. What's the architecture? Well, Jasper Reports library, unsurprisingly, is at the very core of it. We've taken certain select APIs from the Jasper Reports server, have added those, and have taken a subset of Visualize.js as the JavaScript API. So we've taken some key components from things that have been already tested out in the real world and have brought them together to create something really focused on one specific task in a cloud-native environment. And now Theodore is going to show you exactly what that looks like. Theodore?
Thank you, Jan. We'll spend a moment to switch screens here. I'll share my screen. And I'm going to jump into the product. Jasper Reports, what we're going to see now is the contents of the Jasper Reports IO Professional Edition, version 1.0 edition. We offer this product for all the platforms. We have a distribution for Windows, one for Linux, and in my case here, I have a distribution for Mac OS. These are zip packages that you download from our website and then you extract on your machine and you're ready to go. We're looking at the contents of such a zip. You see we're shipping the Java virtual machine so that you have everything you need to start using the product. We're talking about the web application exposing a REST API, and we're running this web application using the Jetty web server, so we ship Jetty as well. The web application itself is under this folder called GRIO. If we go to the web apps folder, we see the GRIO folder. This is the main service we're talking about. This is the service that is going to produce all the reports and data visualizations that I'm going to show you during this demo. is a pure REST API web application, and it doesn't have a UI of its own. So when we run it, there's nothing to look at because it's not a normal web application. We can only make calls to it, providing parameter data and get back the response and capture the output and do something with it. However, for the sake of having user getting started with the product easier, we're also shipping a demo application, and it is this demo application that I'm going to show to you in a few moments. Our client-side API, all the JavaScript that we offer for embedding the reports and data visualizations into other reports, and all the JavaScript that is behind the interactivity that all these reports expose, we isolated it in a separate web application so that you can use it either from here or copy it into your own web application and use it from there when you embed your reports. So we'll see how this API is used, but just to point out that these are separate web applications that we deploy by default with the package. If you're familiar with our Jaspersoft technology, like Jasper Report Server, Jasper Reports Library, of course, and you've been using Jaspersoft Studio to design these reports, you know that we have this engine that relies on the so-called report templates, which are the XML files with a special syntax, and we call them grXML. These are the reports we design visually with Jaspersoft Studio, and I'm going to show that as well. But right now, I'm pointing to the fact that with Jasper Reports.io, we ship this repository, which is file-based and contains all the report samples and the resources that they need to run and be able to view them with the demo application. The repository itself is configurable inside Jasper Reports.io. The product ships with a pre-configured repository in this folder, but you can point to S3 buckets, to FTP servers. You can point to, I don't know, any other custom implementation of a repository as long as it's able to deliver file resources that are needed when the report is run. So now the start and stop scripts are there for you to easily start the service and then stop it. Just a quick configuration that you can make in the start script. By default, we allow the server to use 0.5 GB of RAM, but you can give it more. You can change the port and make other configuration to tailor to your needs. So let's start this service on my machine. I'm going to use a terminal window. I'm in that folder where the start script is and launching the service. You can see it comes up in under 4 seconds on this particular machine. And I'm now ready to use the service, and I'll switch to a browser window. But I repeat, since it's a REST API service producing reports and data visualizations, I would need to know how to compose an HTTP request to get what I want. But I'm not going to show that right away to you. Instead, we're going to take a look at this demo application I mentioned, which runs from the same Jetty server that we prepackaged with the product. And it's good because it introduces you to the product. It starts with a quick start guide to explain some of the basic configurations that we looked at, like memory, ports, repository. It contains our REST API documentation with the various endpoints of this REST API, the one to run production reporting, in PDF, Excel, or other formats, and the other entry points for working with interactive reports. They're all documented in detail here and will help you understand how the service works. It also documents our JavaScript API with various examples that show you how to embed visualizations and reports into your own application, and we're going to take a look at that. But first of all, let's see some of the reports that we're able to generate. These are samples that we ship with the zip that I mentioned. Let's click on one of them. What we see on screen now is our demo interactive report viewer. It's demo because it's part of the demo application, and we've put it together using our JavaScript API. If you like it, you can take it and use it as is into your own application. Just to demonstrate that the reports I'm seeing here are fully interactive, I can click on table column and sort I can move from one page to another using the pagination controls. I can zoom in, zoom out, and even undo my sorting operation. So it's all interactive, and again, it's based on our JavaScript API. The same JavaScript API that you'll be able to use yourself to embed reports in a lower level manner, and we're going to see how. Of course, I can export to the various formats. PDF comes right away, and it's pixel perfect, looks just like in the viewer itself. So this is the interactive report viewing experience, which is part of the functionality that we deliver with this product. But let's go back a little to the so-called operational or production reporting, in which we make calls to the REST API to produce PDF or Excel files directly. Imagine you would have, I don't know, long-running jobs that generate thousands and thousands of reports in PDF format overnight, either for archiving or for sending over by email, or for sending or printing to send by a regular mail. So this type of operational reporting can be done by making REST API calls. And our documentation explains the syntax of this call. So let's see one of these calls. Well, it's a call made against the GRIO application. It starts with res v2 prefix. And I want to generate a report. So this, the path continues with the word reports. And now I'm supposed to give the URL, the path of the report within the repository. If we look back at the repository content, I see I have samples, reports, some folders here, and I'm targeting this report here, orders table .grxml. So let's take its relative path within the repository and put it here. So it's samples, reports, orders table. And I want it in PDF format. I also happen to know that it accepts a couple of parameters. One is city, which is for filtering. I want to see the customer orders from Paris, let's say. And then a second parameter, which is a number, right, used as a threshold for conditionally formatting the arrows that we see on the third column there in the report. So let's use fright equals 9. I hit enter, and I end up with this PDF. And it has orders from Paris with a threshold of 9, controlling the colors of these up and down arrows. Sorry. So imagine I would make such REST calls programmatically. So I'm going to show you a little script I wrote for this demonstration. It's in this folder here, in which I generate reports in an automated way. It's a simple script in which I declare a short list of cities, Paris, Berlin, Madrid, and I loop through these cities and make a REST call to this service. And I'm pointing to the same report that we just tested, orders table. I want it in PDF format, but every time I execute this call, it's a different city. So let's execute this report in a terminal window. Just opening a terminal window and going to that particular folder where my batch script is. So running the batch. In a few milliseconds, I have 3 reports generated for me. Let's see the list. They're all here. I have a PDF for Berlin, one for Madrid, and one for Paris. If I look at one of them, for example, Madrid, there you go. You have Madrid and the customer orders from Madrid. So this is like a simple kind of report bursting, generating reports in automated way. Now, I would go back to report embedding and interactive report viewing to give you a little bit more complex example. In order to do that, I will navigate to our JavaScript API samples and show you how a report can be embedded into a web page. What we're looking at is this web tool called JS Fiddle. Maybe some of you are familiar with it, but in short, it's like a sandbox on the web, which helps me write HTML, JavaScript, and CSS in order to construct a page that I can preview online. So in this particular case, I'm working on a web page in which I want to embed this chart report that is coming from GRIO. So how would I use the JavaScript API from JasperReports.io? Well, first of all, on my page, I need to include this script, GRIO JavaScript. And then I need to define a container, a visual container as a placeholder for where I put my report on the page. In this case is a div element that I give a name or identifier report container. And then once I included that script, I'm able to work with the JasperReports.io client API. And I have a client-side object, which I have to use to configure up front, because I need to specify where is the location of my JasperReports.io service, the one that actually runs those reports for me. I also need to specify the location of the scripts that make up the JavaScript API, mostly because, you know, when working with an interactive report, there are a bunch of dialogues and UI elements that are part of this JavaScript API that we basically import on the page. And they're also subject to theming. We're using the default theme, but we can have custom themes and change colors and fonts and the way the whole thing looks like. And once I configure my client-side object, I run the reports using the report function called on the GRIO client object. And when running a report, I again need to specify its location within the repository and the container where I want it to appear on my page. So this is the most simple or the most basic example of embedding. But they can be more complicated because we allow you to fully control the output of the report. And let's look at an embedding case. On my machine, I have a website. I actually have a virtual host here that runs Apache. And it's HTTP Theodore. And this website, which is a virtual host on my laptop, runs a website called FreshGRIO. If we look at it, it's a typical online shopping experience. I can go search for food products, make my selection, add to shopping cart, make a purchase. But some of the pages here display some information about my stores. And these pages use visualizations that are generated by JasperReports.io behind the scenes. And they're embedded into this page using the same technique that I just showed you. These two charts are two separate reports, actually, and they're interconnected in the sense that once I click on the first one, the bottom one reacts to the current selection that I just performed. So they're fully interactive. Furthermore, there's additional interactivity on the page itself with these two buttons on the left side. I have a JavaScript event when clicking on this button to change the parameters that we fed as a filter into the second chart. So you see I can select only my top 10 stores, the ones that make the best sales on a monthly basis or things like that. And I have a second button which triggers a JavaScript event in which I reset that filter parameter for the second report. So I again see all the store sales. These two buttons that control the behavior of these two reports are no different from the buttons we've seen earlier that were controlling pagination and export and things like that. So you can use the API to control your reports, the very reports that you embed on your page. So just to wrap it up, just a mention to how all these reports that we've seen have been created. Well, they've been created with Jaspersoft Studio. Here, this is our report design tool that you would normally use with Jasper Report Server or for the library itself, but it works for JasperReports.io as well. And here inside a project that I created in Jaspersoft Studio, I simply imported the repository folder, and I can go to the same report, make a little modification, let's say, change the color, make it opaque. And when I save this report, the live modification I just made in the repository can be seen here if I refresh the report. Okay, so I will now hand it back to Jan for wrapping it up. Jan?
Okay, so back to Jasper Reports IO. Where can you get it, and how is it available? So from the TIBCO Jaspersoft site, it's a downloadable archive with a Docker file for production deployment. So what we mean is you really get two things here. You get the downloadable archive, which will have JRIO in it, and all the supporting artifacts you need to get it up and running, which means you can run it on your laptop. You can actually run it in a VM, bare metal server, without a container. Now, if you're using a containerized environment, you're using a cloud-native environment, we include what's called a Docker file. A Docker file is effectively a Docker container technology scripting file that will deploy JRIO into a container. And of course, if you're running this in a production environment, you may have some other components that you want to layer along with that. Maybe things that allow you to better connect to your orchestration layer. Maybe it's application monitoring or logging. Anyway, this Docker file gives you a good starting point, and you can either use it as is or modify it to fit your needs, and then push JRIO into a container. So that's available as a free trial through the end of the year, absolutely free until the end of the year. So now would be a perfect time for you to download it, and either yourself or your developers or someone else in your organization can start to take a look at it and figure out what kind of role it can play in your application. Or if you're thinking about moving to a cloud-native architecture, this would be a great way to understand how some of these components work. So as of January 1st, it will be sold as a yearly subscription for $299 a year. And Shane, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that also includes Jaspersoft Studio Professional.
That's correct.
Okay. So keep that in mind. Between now and the end of the year, it'll be a great time to get yourself started in one form or another. It's also available on the AWS Marketplace as an AMI. So you'll find that in the marketplace. You can get started. That does have a 19 cents an hour utility pricing model along with it. It's not completely free, but then again, AWS is taking care of a lot of the management for you and the deployment. So those are the two current ways that you can actually deploy it. So let's talk about what's coming down the road in the future. And I have to give a standard disclaimer here. This is a statement of direction. We are not committing to a specific product or any specific delivery timeline. This is just a forward-looking statement of direction. We're looking really between 6 and 12 months out. And this is Jasper Reports IO as a true microservice without any kind of throttling or constraints on its capacity or ability to scale. So what will be different about this? Well, the architecture is going to be a bit different because it's going to create the capabilities for real scale, embedding at big scale, dynamic scaling, high availability, resilience, and to connect into an orchestration layer. So this means as the number of requests for visualizations or reports come in, you'll be able to dynamically scale the number of containers, in this case, running JRIO. Those containers will all have some kind of shared cache or persistence so that if one container goes down, another container takes over for it immediately. And that's very, very powerful. Right, so then you can have an orchestration layer. It can monitor what's going on. You can make sure that it has enough control so that you never have the service go down. And as your capacity will then grow with your demand and then shrink again as demand decreases. So again, this is really what we were talking about a couple of slides ago. We talked about the modern cloud native architecture. This will really be a part of this. And again, watch this space. We'll let you know when it's imminent, and it's, again, out there 6 to 12 months. So Shane, back to you.
Great. Thank you, Jan, and thank you, Tidor. I know we're already over time. I want to show you where you can get all this stuff very quickly. And then I also want to leverage having Jan and Tidor here available for Q&A. So again, if you are able to hang out for another 5 to 10 minutes and go through the slide in about 60 seconds, and then we're going to open up for Q&A. So if you have questions in your mind right now, go ahead and start plugging those into the Q&A box. The first thing that I'll point out on this slide is one thing we wanted to do for everyone was centralize all of the resources around Jasper Reports IO in one spot. And that's done on the URL on the left, jaspersoft.com/what's new. And that includes a general overview at a high level of which Jasper Reports IO is. And then if you see in the bottom, I don't know if that's clear or not, there's a resource hub which links out to what we call a quick start guide, which is actually shown there on the right, which includes a lot of great materials that videos that Theodore has put together. I know there are a few questions on a more detailed demonstration or video of some of the things that Theodore was showing. That's all included as part of that quick start guide, as well as a number of tutorials around using Jasper Reports IO with Jaspersoft Studio. Those are actually created by Giulio Tifoli, who is the architect behind that product. So a lot of great resources to help you be successful in trying out Jasper Reports IO. And on the right, as I mentioned, that's the getting started process. You can access that either through the What's New page on the left, or you can use that URL directly. And then the last thing that I'll mention, Jan just mentioned Jasper Reports IO Enterprise. That is something coming next year. If you're interested in participating in that early adopter program, you can send an email to the email alias there below, js-product-team@tibco.com. That will go directly to our product team, and they'll follow up with you about how you can participate in that program. So with that, I'm going to open up for Q&A. I know we already have a number of questions that have come in. And let's start with this one. And I think this is a great clarifying question. So the question is, how is this different from visualize.js and your v2_rest services? Or is this all about containerizing Jasper server and we continue to use visualize.js and v2_rest under the JRIO name?
I think either Theodore or I can handle this. I'm happy to speak to this. So how is it different? Different from Visualize and our REST v2 API, the server? Well, they're based on both of those. So Visualize.js, as it's deployed with JRIO, is a subset of Visualize.js. Like, for example, you are not going to have dashboard rendering. It will be report rendering. You'll have the report object. It will have the same capabilities in that you'll be able to embed directly into, let's say, a div tag or other element, meaning that you can have events affect the visualization and it affect other components on the page as well. So it's that same level of integration and the same ease, just a few lines of code. But no, it does not have the complete API. It doesn't have all the capabilities of Visualize.js, but what if you use Visualize.js right now applies directly to what we ship with JRIO. Same for the V2 REST API, right? So JRIO doesn't have a repository in the same way that JRS does. It doesn't have domains. It doesn't have ad hoc. So there are a lot of APIs around other aspects of JRS that don't apply to JRIO. The ones that do, the APIs are the same. So it's a subset of both. Does that answer the question? I guess we don't really know. Is this all about containerizing Jasper server? It is about not containerizing Jasper server. It's about taking what we think are core capabilities out of our existing product suite, putting them together in something that's perfectly suited for cloud-native microservice architectures. If you really want to containerize Jasper Server, you can use Jasper Server for Docker, which is a Docker file, complex, comprehensive Docker file that will allow you to put JRS into a container. We have customers who are putting JRS into a container and Tomcat and the repo database in separate ones, so they can orchestrate those together. So you have a lot of options there, but no, this is not about trying to containerize JRS or competing with its capabilities.
Great. There's another similar question. Does Jasper Reports IO include functionality for ad hoc end user reports, or would that be implemented as a separate concern? I think, Jan, you kind of answered that Jasper Reports IO is deliberately designed to do just one thing, and that's report and data visualization rendering. It doesn't include a lot of the components from Jasper Reports Server, and so that's something that would not come with Jasper Reports IO, but that was an intentional piece of the architectural design to fit in with kind of the microservices approach of doing one thing and doing one thing very well. There's another question on, do you have plans to support Google Cloud Platform as well as AWS? I know we touched on AWS a bit, but I'll let either Jan or Tito elaborate.
Sure, I think I can answer that one as well. So one of the things that is a property really of containerization, and it was actually on a slide, but I didn't really emphasize it, is that it really is vendor agnostic. Deploy into a container, and technically it wouldn't even have to be a Docker container. We include a Docker file, but you could use like a PCF droplet, or there's some other technologies. You can deploy it in, on Google's cloud as well. So you can take advantage of AWS services, and we provide some perhaps maybe slightly easier ways to do that just because of our tight relationship with them. But there's nothing to prevent you from deploying it on Google Cloud at all. There is no specific dependency between any services on AWS and JRIO.
All right, we've got another question on, we talked about Professional Edition, we talked about the Enterprise Edition. I know there's mention of Jasper Reports IO Cloud on the website. That's something we probably won't discuss today, but Jan, maybe you could talk about some of the differences between the Professional Edition, some of the limitations of that, and then how that differs from the Enterprise Edition.
Sure, and again, if we take a look at the Professional Edition, it's designed for very low volume. We actually have limited the report executions to 2 simultaneous executions, and basically have 2 workers that are working through a queue, only 2 at a time. And the licensing, Shane, I think, correct me if I'm wrong here, I believe that the licensing on JRIO on this first iteration is really just for a single container, right? A single instance at a time.
Correct, no clustering.
Yeah. So really it's designed for low volume and for limited number of report executions. And we're going to be evolving that licensing model over time, as well as the technology behind it for greater and greater scale. But again, this is another reason why I emphasize that now is the right time to download this version and understand the capabilities, so that as time goes on, you can figure out where this can fit into your production environment, and that you also know that, again, looking forward, we are going to be developing further capabilities.
Great. There's another question. Just, I guess, in general, will it be more performant? And I'm assuming this is referring to, versus Jasper Report Server. Let Tito or Jan comment on this.
It depends what you mean by more performant, under what circumstances, in what kind of architecture. I mean, it's sort of like it's apples and oranges. There are certain aspects of the server that are inherently going to make things a little slower just because you're talking about just the stack that it's built on. Perhaps. It also depends on the version. So let's just say, it's 6 to 12 months down the road. We have JRIO, this enterprise version. One of the properties or principles of design for microservices is that you can keep the performance consistent, meaning that if you have a service, in this case, one that renders visualizations and reports, let's say you have 2 containers running, and you can handle, let's say, just whatever your app is, the load of 20 users and what they do with reports and visualizations. Well, if suddenly 200 users all need the same services out of your app, if you set up your orchestration layer to scale, suddenly it would create maybe 15 new containers, meaning that the response time to your end users should stay the same. They shouldn't be aware that there's been, more work actually thrown at your application. They shouldn't be aware that there's greater load on it because you've actually scaled the resources that affect their user experience dynamically, immediately in real time. So in that sense, it has this capability containerization and microservices create this capability to create greater throughput dynamically. And that's something that JRS doesn't do. However, it just because the way it's been designed, it's also designed one instance of JRS can handle many connections and can handle many executions. So it's not, sorry, that's probably a little confusing, but I guess the point is it's not really an apples to oranges kind of comparison.
Thank you, Jan. And I think we'll take about 2 more, and then we'll have to follow up with the rest of you after the webinar if you've plugged it into the Q&A box. This is a good question, and I'm sure someone probably, a lot of you have this question of your own. Can we use the data from a Jasper Reports IO report to display with our own custom visualizations or widgets?
Theodore?
Yeah, I'll take this one. So indeed, we provide support for plugging custom visualizations into our reports. It's the so-called custom visualization support, where you can bring your D3 or a leaflet or whatever other JavaScript visualization technology and piece of code, and have this graphs, maps, or custom figures rendered inside the report itself. But we've seen cases where people just want to have some data in JSON format, and they'll do their own coding in the browser, in their own application, where they leverage this third-party API themselves if they have the skills in-house. So I would say that one way to leverage data from Jasper Reports IO is to use this so-called metadata exporters. During the demo today, we've been looking at PDF, which is pixel perfect, looks just exactly like the report looked in HTML format. And we have plenty of pixel perfect exporters like that for Excel, Word, and other formats. But we also have the so-called metadata exporters, for which the intent is to produce pure data in CSV, XML, Excel, or JSON format. And these exporters do not have the goal of preserving the layout and the way the report output looks like. Instead, they look at certain markers in the report output, and they filter out certain text fields and values. And it's only those values that they export into a pure data format where all layout and formatting and style is stripped out. So one could imagine that specially made reports like that target pure data output could be used to extract data out of Jasper Reports IO, like from an ETL tool or something, and use that with custom-made visualizations in the parent application.
Excellent. Thank you, Theodore. And I think I'm actually going to call it there because I know we're already about 20 minutes over, and I appreciate everyone sticking on and for all of your questions. Again, we're going to follow up with those questions that we weren't able to get to live, but I just want to give a quick thank you to Jan for introducing us to what Jasper Reports IO is and talking about some of the trends that led to its development, for Theodore for the demonstration, and both of you guys for the Q&A section. And a big thank you for everyone attending for the great questions. I wish you a great rest of your day and a great rest of your week. We hope that you're as excited about this new product as we are. Thank you very much.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.